the spark of a dream. The winter winds off the Atlantic battered the Kennedy estate, rattling windows and filling the vast halls with a restless hum. Inside, young John Fitzgerald Kennedy sat hunched over a worn leather book, his frame slight, his complexion pale. Illness had been his near-constant companion. Scarlet fever, back ailments, endless hospital stays. But weakness never found a home in his spirit. From the marble staircases to the polished dining tables, the Kennedy house echoed with a singular mantra. To those whom much is given, much is expected. It was not a suggestion. It was law. Joseph Kennedy Sr., towering and relentless, studied John with calculating eyes. Unlike his older brother Joe Jr., who embodied robust strength and ambition, John was an enigma, sharp-witted, fiercely curious, yet physically fragile. Behind closed doors, Joseph whispered dreams of political dynasties, of Kennedys seated in marble halls of power. He spoke as if destiny were an inheritance, not something to be earned. John listened, but deep within, a quieter ambition stirred. Less about legacy, more about meaning. On one particular stormy afternoon, when confinement to bed chafed more than the fever in his blood, John slipped from his room and wandered the cliffs beyond the estate. The ocean, wild and endless, roared beneath him. Clutching his coat tighter against the chill, he stared out over the heaving gray waters, heart pounding not from exertion, but from longing. One day, he whispered into the wind, "I'll leave more than a name behind." He didn't know how. He only knew he must. Schooling years passed like pages torn from a book. Choate, Harvard, each step marked by flashes of brilliance and bouts of crippling sickness. Teachers praised his mind, marveled at his wit, but worried over his body. Friends admired his charm, yet whispered about his hospital visits. Even among the elite, John lived with a subtle, invisible war waging within him. The fight to be seen as capable, not delicate. At home, comparisons to Joe Jr. sharpened into silent expectations. His mother, Rose, prayed for his health. His father demanded results. John, caught between tenderness and pressure, smiled thinly and pushed forward. Late at night, after the house had surrendered to sleep, John would sit alone at his desk, pen scratching against paper. He wrote about politics, history, courage, always seeking a purpose greater than himself. The candlelight flickered, casting tall shadows on the walls, as if giants loomed just beyond his reach. The world outside remained vast, dangerous, and dismissive. And yet, inside John grew a steady, stubborn fire, a yearning to shape the storm rather than be swallowed by it. Opportunity would come. Conflict would follow. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy, frail but unbroken, was quietly preparing for a battle far greater than anyone in the grand halls of Hyannisport could imagine. The fire of responsibility. The Pacific night was a curtain of endless black, broken only by the dim glow of the stars. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy gripped the edge of PT 109's deck, his mind sharp, his body aching from days without proper rest. War had no patience for weakness, and neither did he. His crew, young men barely older than boys, looked to him now, not for orders, but for certainty. In the chaos of the Solomon Islands, certainty was as rare as mercy. The explosion struck like a hammer from the deep. One moment, the water was calm. The next, a Japanese destroyer split their boat in two with brutal force. Kennedy was thrown into the dark, choking on seawater, the screams of his men slicing through the night. Pain pulsed through his injured back, but instinct roared louder. He surfaced, blinking salt from his eyes, searching, counting. Some men thrashed against the current. Others clung to wreckage, silent and stunned. Kennedy found Patrick McMahon first, his friend's burns horrific, his strength failing. Without hesitation, Kennedy took McMahon's life jacket strap between his teeth and began to swim, dragging the wounded man through miles of open water toward the nearest speck of land. Each stroke was agony, each breath a gamble. But quitting, for Kennedy, was never an option. Hours later, when the survivors collapsed onto the deserted island, their faces gaunt in the moonlight. Kennedy stood sentinel. His body was broken, his spirit bruised, but he refused to surrender. Crawling back into the water by night, he risked sharks, enemy patrols, and drowning to seek help, clutching a coconut scrawled with a desperate message, 11 alive. Need small boat. The ocean offered no easy mercy. For days, the stranded crew battled hunger and fear, Kennedy pushing them onward with jokes he barely believed and promises he didn't know he could keep. Beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at him. Had he led them to salvation or simply prolonged their end? When rescue finally came, it wasn't triumph Kennedy felt, but a heavy, somber gratitude. In the silence that followed, he realized survival carried its own unbearable responsibility. Men had lived, and some had died, under his command. That weight would never lift. Returning home, the easy road beckoned. Wealth, recognition, and comfort waited behind familiar doors. But Kennedy knew, deep in his battered bones, that he owed the world more than quiet luxury. Duty, once a distant concept shaped by his father's ambitions, had been forged into something real and deeply personal. Late one evening, tucked away in a small, dimly lit study, Kennedy wrote to an old friend. The true test is not what one endures, but what one builds afterward. The pen trembled slightly in his hand, but the resolve in his heart was unshakable. War had shown him who he truly was. Now, destiny awaited, and it would not wait long. The weight of the world. The day he took the oath, the sky above Washington shone with brittle winter light. John F. Kennedy, the youngest elected president in American history, stood tall against the cold, his voice steady as it carried the dreams of a restless nation. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The words soared, but deep within, Kennedy knew the true battle was only beginning. The glamour of victory faded quickly. Barely months into his presidency, the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe. In quiet war rooms, surrounded by solemn-faced generals and advisors, Kennedy listened to grim reports. Soviet missiles inching closer to American shores, the delicate thread of diplomacy fraying fast. The Cuban Missile Crisis was no chess match. It was a countdown to annihilation. Each decision weighed heavier than the last. Attack and risk nuclear war. Wait and risk betrayal. In the flickering fluorescent lights of the cabinet room, Kennedy's face grew gaunt, his hands tight against his chair, each silent second stretching into eternity. Around him, voices clashed, hawks urging force, others whispering caution, but the final burden rested squarely on his shoulders. Late into the nights, he wandered the White House rose garden alone, the scent of damp earth rising around him. The world saw a polished leader. Here, among the silent blooms, he wrestled with invisible fears. A misstep would cost millions their lives. A weakness could shatter a fragile peace. And yet, through the strain, a new layer of resolve hardened within him. He chose a blockade over bombardment, words over missiles. It was a dangerous gamble, a dance on the blade's edge. Days blurred into nights, the American people holding their breath alongside their president. When Khrushchev finally blinked, ordering the withdrawal of Soviet missiles, relief swept the world. But Kennedy did not celebrate. Victory tasted bittersweet when measured against the risks taken and the horrors narrowly avoided. Beyond foreign threats, another war raged at home. Across the American South, civil rights protests ignited like brush fires. Calls for justice battered against walls of deep-seated hate. In June 1963, Kennedy addressed the nation, his words deliberate, his tone unflinching. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. In private moments, however, the burden nearly crushed him. Advisors criticized him for moving too slowly. Opponents accused him of doing too much. Every choice was a lose-lose equation, yet he chose to press forward. Through it all, Kennedy wore his trademark smile, disarming and distant. Few saw the toll it took. Few knew how often he sat in the dim light of the Oval Office, staring at a future he might never reach, sketching plans for a better world he might never see. He understood now. Leading was not about glory. It was about carrying the unbearable, knowing the world would judge, often without understanding the cost. Outside the windows, the gardens swayed in the night wind, and the clock ticked toward a future no man could guarantee. The echo that never fades. November 22nd, 1963. The streets of Dallas buzzed with excitement, the air heavy with anticipation. A motorcade, a procession of waving hands, flashing smiles. Yet, in the quiet corners of the country, something darker loomed. Kennedy had always known time was fleeting, but now he could feel it slip through his fingers more than ever before. He sat beside Jacqueline, his eyes scanning the crowd, aware of the crowd's fervor, but there was something in the way they cheered that unsettled him. The warmth of their greetings, the brightness of their faces, they seemed almost too eager. He had known love, admiration, and also the lurking shadows of animosity. In this moment, with the Texas sky wide above him, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. Then, in a split second, the world shifted. A sharp crack split the air, the sound of life and death interwoven. The